Hello, and welcome to the National Press Foundation's online briefing on COVID-19, homelessness, and eviction issues. We are thrilled to have with us today 4 experts who will lead reporters through some very important tips and strategies on how to get your head around this particular issue. This is an interactive briefing. We are hopeful that a lot of you will ask questions. There are 2 ways to ask questions. One is to raise your hands. There's a raise hand button at the bottom of your screens. If you raise your hands, I'll be able to see that. And then at a break between speakers or when we are in the Q&A session, we will work as many of you as possible into that into it to asking your question. I'll say, so and so you are now unmuted and you can ask your question. The other way to ask questions is by writing them in the Q&A function. We will also see those. Other people can see those questions and they can upvote them if it's a question that a lot of you want answered. Hit the little thumbs up button so we can make sure to ask the questions that are most important to the most of you. While we're waiting just another minute for folks to come online, I just want to give you an update about our next program at the National Press Foundation. We are, like everybody else, doing everything online these days. Next Monday at 12 o'clock Eastern, 11 o'clock Central, we will have a book talk with Jason Berry from New Orleans, who is the author of The Great Influenza, a fascinating and one of the best histories of the 1918 influenza pandemic. Which has obviously become more relevant today. He will talk about that book and the lessons from 1918 that still apply today, although obviously the situations are different. And that'll be a book talk with him. He will talk about his book, and I'll have plenty of time for Q&A with him. And so now let's talk about evictions. National Press Foundation has done 3 webinars on homelessness and COVID-19 issues, including the health ramifications of it, the impact of the frontline workers who are dealing with it. And then today we want to talk about evictions and what we think will happen with the economic dislocation leading to people not being able to pay their rent next month or the following month, and kind of what that means going forward. We have with us 4 experts: Matthew Desmond, the author of the landmark book Evicted; Alieza Durana from the Eviction Lab at Princeton University, who will talk about evictions related data; Nan Roman, the head of you may want to make sure I get the name right, Nan, I apologize for that, the head of the National Alliance to End Homelessness, who will talk about legislative action that has already taken place and that likely will take place; and Juan Pablo Garnham from the Texas Tribune, who will talk about coverage and how he has found and executed stories in this particular space. So we are going to start with Matthew Desmond, who is a professor of sociology at Princeton University. I mentioned the book Evicted. If I were to list all the awards that book has won, we would kind of run out most of the hour on that. But from the journalist perspective, he has won the Pulitzer Prize. He has won a MacArthur Genius Fellowship, and he has won a bunch of other awards about the book, which follows families in Milwaukee in 2008 during that economic downturn, and describe the situation that most people, the precarious financial situation that most people are in, and what happened during the last economic downturn. Then he will be able to talk today about how that might have an impact on today's economic downturn. So Matthew, we'll turn over to you right now.
Thank you, Chris. Good afternoon. So the COVID outbreak hit America during one of the worst housing crises the country has seen in generations. This crisis was caused by 3 ingredients. Incomes for many Americans have been flatlined over the last 2 decades. In some areas of the country, they've fallen in real terms, but rents have soared. Between 2000 and today, median asking rent in America has more than doubled, unadjusted for inflation. And that increase has gone much faster than increases we've seen in incomes for basically all the American workforce. So imagine a closing gap between what many families are bringing in and what they have to pay for basic shelter needs. And then we've seen a lot of government inaction. So only 1 in 4 families who qualify for any kind of housing assistance, rental vouchers, public housing, only 1 in 4 receive any help. So the vast majority, the unlucky majority, receive no housing assistance from the government. And that's created a situation where the percentage of low-income renters below the official poverty line, paying most of their income to housing costs, has gone up and up to the point that today the majority of poor renting families spend over 50% of their income on housing costs. And about 1 in 4 of those families, according to the latest data from the American Housing Survey, are spending over 70% of their income just on rent and utilities. That's before the crisis. So that leads us to a situation where eviction has become incredibly commonplace around the country. For the last couple of years, a team of researchers and myself have been building a national data set of evictions. And I wanted to show you a little bit of that tool so you can see how you might be able to interact with that on your own stories and storytelling. So our website is called theevictionlab.org, and we've built a national database of eviction. And we've released this database in a way that allows people to interact with the data in a very intuitive way. There's mapping tools that you can use to zoom down on the block level. There's ranking tools that you can use to kind of see how your city or town or community ranks in terms of the latest eviction data that we have. And this is a giant database compiled of over 80 million evictions that go back to the year 2000. So what have we learned? And just a reminder, an eviction is when a judge legally mandates that a tenant leave a rental property, and that's different from a foreclosure, which happens to homeowners when the bank says they have to go. So between 2000 and 2016, there were over 61 million evictions all across the United States. In 2016, 3.7 million eviction cases were filed around the United States, according to our best estimate. That means 7 evictions filed every minute across the country. That means each year, the number of eviction files far, far outweighs the number of foreclosure starts at the height of the foreclosure crisis. So think about the foreclosure crisis level of displacement happening every single year to renters. Now, sometimes this story gets told in the media as if it only exists in LA and San Francisco and New York. But if you dig in the data, you see some of the highest evicting cities are places like Tulsa, Oklahoma, Albuquerque, New Mexico, Richmond, Virginia, Wilmington, Delaware. These aren't cities that really are top of mind when it comes to the housing crisis in the country if you just look at rents. But if you look at people that are forcibly losing their homes, you see the eviction crisis is a much bigger story than just a coastal story or even just an urban story. We see some small towns and suburban communities around the country having eviction rates that rival some of the biggest evicting cities. Why does this matter? Well, I think it's pretty intuitive, right? Eviction has been linked to homelessness, but it's been linked to a lot of other negative things too, like depression, job loss. People that have a mark of eviction on their record, often that sullies your credit. That bars you from public housing a lot of times. So we see from the data, after people get evicted, they move into worse housing they lived in before, they moved into worse neighborhoods. And in the context of the outbreak that's happening now, this has implications not only for homelessness and poverty, but also for public health. In China, most cases were caused by family-to-family transmission. Homeless shelters are a really important part of our safety net. These are places where people sleep in the same room and eat shoulder to shoulder next to each other. So if we see a rise of evictions because of COVID, we probably will see something that's also contributing to the crisis. So I think the bottom line here is before COVID, the United States was in the grips of a giant housing crisis caused by rents outpacing incomes. That crisis caused millions of evictions to be filed around the United States every year. And these evictions were filed not just in coastal cities, but in states all around the country and including municipalities that are fairly low cost and even small towns. We've been studying eviction moratoriums here at the Eviction Lab, and Alieza is going to talk about that. I want to kind of try to suggest another implication of the work that has to do with landlord profits. And this is kind of the note I'll close on. It's from a study called Do the Poor Pay More for Housing? And this study should be accessible to you, but if anyone wants to see a copy and you can't get it, please email me. So this draws on 2 kinds of data, the national data from the Rental Housing Finance Survey and data from Milwaukee. I just want you to study this table, and I just want you to look at the two rows in red. These are mortgage payments for landlords in affluent, middle class, and poor neighborhoods. These are poor neighborhoods or neighborhoods with 27% poverty or more, affluent neighborhoods with 8% poverty or less. What you see in the mortgage payment line is that in a typical month, a landlord in a poor neighborhood doesn't have a mortgage payment because usually they've already paid off the property or bought it outright. That's a different story in landlords in non-poor neighborhoods. This means, and this is a big reason why, going to that other red line at the bottom, landlords in poor neighborhoods have much bigger profit margins than landlords in middle class or even affluent neighborhoods by a significant amount. And so for me, this has implications for the media narrative, where the narrative about rent payments leading to foreclosures because of missed mortgage payments is a story that applies mostly in non-poor neighborhoods. And the narrative about thin profit margins that landlords are facing is a narrative that also applies mostly in non-poor neighborhoods. So thanks so much for your time. Looking forward to your questions.
Okay. So Matthew, I do have one question that came in. Is an update coming anytime soon for 2017, 18, and 19 data?
We're trying. You know, it's a hard thing to rush. It's incredibly messy data, and we're putting it through the car wash as fast as we can. Okay.
All right. So now we have with us Alieza Durana, who's the narrative change agent at the Eviction Lab at Princeton. She's also a former National Press Foundation fellow on a public health program we had a couple of years ago. Alieza is going to talk about some of the other work that the Eviction Lab is doing, dealing with moratoriums. And so I'll turn over to you, Alieza.
Thank you so much, Chris and Matt, for setting up sort of the context prior to the state of COVID-19. For the last month and a half, we've been encouraged by the quick movement and efforts that we've seen spearheaded by advocates and policymakers around the country to put eviction and foreclosure bans or moratoria into place. Part of why this matters is that we're rapidly approaching Great Depression era levels of unemployment. We're seeing 1 in 3 renters unable to make rent because of COVID-19 and rising unemployment. And many of the workers who have been laid off or are in the most precarious positions lack paid sick days, paid family medical leave, or healthcare. We're seeing the virus disproportionately impact workers of color, women, and low-wage families. So beyond the devastation that Matt described, when families face eviction and the public health consequences of rising eviction as a result of COVID-19 could be catastrophic and much greater than what Matt has already mentioned. So for the last couple of weeks, we've been partnering with legal experts led by Professor Emily Benford at Columbia University to do a comprehensive analysis of what these bans mean in practice. We're also communicating with housing lawyers on the ground in all 50 states and US territories. And what we're seeing is really a policy patchwork across the country. It's good that all states now have something in place, but the eviction process is complex and states and municipalities have taken different approaches to freezing different stages of the eviction process. And there are 3 sort of main avenues by which states and municipalities can do this. They can freeze the initiation of the process, which means that they would limit a landlord's ability to file an eviction notice. Second, courts can step in and alter their procedures to affect sort of whether an eviction filing can move its way through the court system itself. And third, states and municipalities can affect the enforcement of eviction orders, meaning that they can direct law enforcement and others to not carry out orders that have been issued. So at the moment, we'll be in touch with Chris next week to sort of send along our final state scorecard that we've been building that is going to provide a visual aid to cross-compare states in terms of what parts of the process they are freezing. But there are 4 main fault lines that we have identified in the process of doing this analysis. So first is that many states, in fact 38, are still allowing filings even if they have frozen other parts of the legal process. So that means that if you missed your rent payment in April, your landlord could file against you, and once the state of emergency lifts, you could still be evicted and face the negative consequences that Matt described in terms of your credit being sullied, the job loss, mental and physical health issues that are associated with eviction. The second sort of flag that we've identified is that the eviction moratoria, sometimes they cover old eviction filings, and sometimes they cover eviction filings from the COVID-19 era onward. From our perspective, all of the filings should be frozen at the moment because of the sort of importance of secure and safe housing, both for individuals and family generally, and also in terms of the public health effects that an eviction could have in this particular historic moment. The third flag that we've identified is that some states are allowing localities or municipalities to interpret the eviction bans as they see fit. So let's say in a state like Florida, where Miami has issued its own moratoria and has gone, above and beyond, there may be other municipalities in the state of Florida that are not being as proactive about protecting tenants in this process. And Florida is sort of one of the states that we're watching there. And then fourth, one of the last concerns that we have is that some states, including the state of California, are requiring tenants to prove that they have been affected by COVID-19. It's not really clear to us how you would do that, how you would prove that you're going through hardship, especially if you've been mandated to stay at home. So this seems like an unnecessary bureaucratic hurdle to what should be a basic protection for tenants in this particular moment. What we've also been hearing from the lawyers that we're speaking to on the ground is that eviction filings are piling up. One of the Massachusetts attorneys that we've been in touch with has already tracked 529 new filings. And the Oklahoma court tracker is also seeing comparable numbers. So this is not a red state, blue state, or a rural or urban issue, as Matt mentioned, but really demonstrates the importance of freezing the entire process from initiation to execution. So a couple of measures that we'll be tracking in this scorecard, which I will send through Chris as soon as it's live, is we'll be scoring states based on whether they are allowing eviction notices to be sent to tenants, whether they're allowing filings for non-payment of rent during the crisis, whether they're allowing filings for other urgent reasons during the crisis, whether the court is still hearing cases, whether eviction judgments are stayed, whether court deadlines are delayed or told, that there will be no enforcement of new or existing orders of eviction, no late fees or interest associated with the eviction process. And then we're also looking into whether states are giving time to tenants to pay back rent that they might have missed. And we now have one state that is piloting that, which is the state of Connecticut. So we hope that we will see other states follow suit. We will also be including a measure for foreclosures and utility shutoffs because having access to water amid a shutdown is very important, both for hygiene and just basic day-to-day living. And we look forward and welcome your feedback as the scorecard goes live. It has truly been a collaborative effort as we try to track and provide support to those most at risk of housing insecurity in this particular moment. Thank you.
Okay, Alieza, thank you very much. And as she mentioned, when the scorecard is available, we will forward it to, or forward the information, the link on to all the people who registered for this Zoom webinar. A reminder on asking questions. If you want to raise your hand, we'll work you in and ask an audio question. We have one now from Nick Gruby from the Honolulu Civil Beat. Nick, we're getting you unmuted. Nick, you can go ahead and ask your question.
Hi there. Thank you guys so much for taking the time to go over this with us. So I was looking at the Eviction Lab data, and there's a lot of great information there, but not particularly for my coverage area, which includes urban Honolulu. So I guess I was wondering if you could maybe walk us through how we can go about sort of building our own database, if you will, or at least going and pulling election filings and highlighting some of the things that we as reporters should be looking for if we wanted to get a better view of what's actually happening today.
Sure. So on our website, if you don't see your data, and we don't have every state available, and that's because some states just make it really, really hard to get eviction data. But we do have a detailed methodology report that walks you through every step that we took to get and compile our data. In the least, you should be able to get aggregate level data at the county level in Hawaii. And for more granular data, you could go actually into the courts or see if you can plug into the court system to see if you can scrape data. You could always email us, and we have people that are working in the Eviction Lab that have specific, like someone has looked into the Hawaii case and can answer specific questions about Hawaii as well.
Okay, great, thank you.
Okay, so we'll go to Nan in a second, but we just had a question in, sorry to join late, is there an estimated time when the scorecard is anticipated to go live? Alieza, is that next week, you think?
Yeah, so we have sort of a prototype of the scorecard, and we're anticipating that it'll go live either later this week or early next week. We're just going through a very rigorous check process to make sure that our analysis is up to date, and vetting governor and Supreme Court orders for 50 states and territories just takes time, but we're going to get it up as soon as possible. So. Okay.
So now we're going to go to Nan Roman, President and Chief Executive Officer of the National Alliance to End Homelessness. It's a public education, advocacy, and capacity building organization. She's one of the real leaders, one of the key leaders in homelessness in America. She's going to talk about kind of legislative efforts, the big stimulus package from a few weeks ago, and what might be in the pipeline now, and how those affect housing and homeless issues. So, Nan?
Great, thank you so much. Thanks, Chris, for having me, and to the foundation for having this session. The COVID pandemic certainly is a health crisis, but for very many medically vulnerable people, for very low-income people, for racial and ethnic minorities, it's also a housing crisis. The homeless population, of course, encompasses all of these factors. Homeless people are very poor, they lack housing, they're disproportionately minority, and they have very poor health. With respect to health in particular, concern is over the 200,000 people every night who don't even have a shelter bed, who are unsheltered. They are very ill. Almost half of them report that health problems caused their homelessness, didn't just result from them being outside. Half report that they have a serious illness in their heart, lungs, or other major organs. And almost half are trimorbid, meaning they have physical illness, also mental health and substance abuse disorders. So this group is particularly vulnerable to the virus. To protect people who are homeless from getting the virus, and to take care of those people who do have it, and to prevent its spread, obviously is not just important to people who are homeless, it's important to all of us. And it turns out that a key intervention to accomplishing that is to get them into housing. And given the intersection that Matt talked about of too little affordable housing, not enough rental subsidies, and now the urgency of the pandemic, taking care of this vulnerable population is very important. We're going to have a hard time getting them into housing, and emergency shelter is probably going to be an interim step for many of them. In terms of shelter, different people need different things according to the CDC. Private rooms with bathrooms are needed for people who are especially vulnerable to being infected, which includes older people and those with underlying health problems. Private rooms are also needed for those homeless people who are COVID positive or are suspected of having the virus. People who are symptomatic but don't need hospitalization can be in congregate beds with medical care, and homeless people who are healthy can be in congregate beds. but they need proper social distancing, which is about 100 square feet per person, according to the CDC. Again, as Matt mentioned, very, very few shelters provide that much space for people. And of course, people who are very ill should be hospitalized during respite care. So we asked a great partner of ours, Dr. Dennis Culhane at the University of Pennsylvania, and his colleagues at UCLA and Boston University to estimate how much it would cost for the homeless system to implement these CDC guidelines for social distancing, quarantine, and isolation. Their estimate was $11.5 billion. So that is the amount that we asked Congress for in the CARES Act. I should also mention, and I'll share with the foundation the link to this article, because some of you may find it interesting. It also provides this information about costs, as well hospitalization, anticipated hospitalization rates and mortality for every county. So it might be something that would be useful to you in your reporting. We didn't get the $11.5 billion in the CARES Act, but we did get $4 billion specifically targeted to homeless people through the Emergency Solutions Grant at HUD, which was better than the $1 billion that we started out with. So I think that research did help. The Emergency Solutions Grant Program is very flexible funding. It can be used for shelter for services, food, short-term housing subsidies, and it goes to state, county, and local governments. There are also other resources in the CARES Act that could be used to help people who are homeless. There's $5 billion in the Community Development Block Grant Program, also at HUD. It's not targeted specifically to homeless people, but it is available to jurisdictions for a wide variety of housing and community development activities, including rental assistance. And there's also $150 billion in the Coronavirus Relief Fund, which is flexible funding for states and localities that could again be used to help homeless people. There's some Medicaid and other provisions in the bill that support organizations that provide services to homeless people as well. In terms of people who need to be quarantined in private rooms, many jurisdictions are starting to contract with we have a lot of vacancy nowadays in hotels, motels, student dormitories. There's lots of space that's not being used. And a lot of jurisdictions are contracting motel and hotel space in particular to help with homeless people. FEMA can often pay for that space, and there's also $45 billion for FEMA in the CARES Act. The Act also places a temporary moratorium on evictions for non-payment of rent in housing that is federally supported, a 120-day moratorium. Late penalties are also forbidden. But as Alieza said, this is rent for, or discussed in similar circumstances, this is rent forbearance. It's not rent forgiveness. And people who are already living in subsidized housing, so are probably having a difficult time getting through this period may have employment issues and so forth, they're still going to owe all of that rent, presumably at the end of this moratorium. Homeless people may also be eligible for the individual payments, which could help them pay for a place to stay. And the IRS just over the weekend announced a program for non-filers. Most homeless people don't file for income taxes or to pay income tax because they don't make enough money. That was a big problem. The IRS has set something up so that they can get that individual payment. So help is on the way from the CARES Act, not enough, but definitely help. We're going to need more. In the next stimulus bill that's in the works, the Alliance and other partner national organizations are asking for the remaining $7.5 billion that's needed for the homeless emergency system. Also $4 billion for rapid rehousing, which is short-term rental subsidy, and $150 billion for longer-term rental assistance. So far, we've had a decent reception presenting that on the Hill, but as you know, the outlines, even the outlines of this bill are in dispute now, and it's very unclear how it's going to end up. I've often been asked by the press in the past couple of weeks if there's likely to be any silver lining to this cloud that we're living through. Is the experience of the pandemic increasing people's understanding of the impact of income and racial inequality? How differently people in different circumstances are experiencing the crisis, and how costly it is to have so many people who are vulnerable because they don't have their basic needs for housing, food, or healthcare met. I can certainly say that I hope that that will be the result of it. Maybe we will emerge from the whole thing with a broad consensus that things have gone too far and that a floor beneath which people cannot be allowed to fall is not really a luxury for us as a country, but a necessity. But even if that realization does emerge, it's really difficult for me to see how it's going to be paid for. The federal government is on track to spend a year's worth of budget in 2 months, and state and local governments are going to be broke if they aren't already. And there are going to be a lot of people in very, very vulnerable economic conditions and who, without serious financial assistance, as has already been mentioned, are going to lose their homes. And I think it's very possible that we will simply trade one group of homeless people for another group. I think it's going to depend a lot on how long this all goes on and how our national priorities shape up. But I certainly hope that there will be a silver lining and that we can meet the aspirations of our better selves and address the deeper racial and economic inequalities that have been so much in play in this current pandemic. Thank you, Chris.
Okay, so thank you very much, Nan. We will go to Juan Pablo in just 1 second, but we do have a question specifically for Nan from Sarah Ruiz-Grossman of HuffPost. Question for Nan, kind of long, so I'll read the whole thing. In San Francisco, which has pretty low numbers of COVID-19 cases, there was a recent outbreak at a homeless shelter. 71 people, or about half of the clients, tested positive. Those people were removed and isolated in hotels, and then the shelter was turned into a COVID-specific treatment space. But advocates are protesting today, saying that the city should place homeless people in hotels now or before they contract coronavirus, not after. The city says it's only using hotels to isolate COVID-positive cases among homeless people, as well as keeping rooms open for possible surge in hospital cases. So Nan, what would you recommend? Should all homeless people be placed in hotels preemptively to avoid more outbreaks at shelters?
Well, all homeless people should be placed in housing. That would be the best solution. If they can't be placed in housing, I think the indication is that people who are vulnerable to catching the virus, so people who are elderly or who have underlying health conditions, should be in private rooms with private facilities. And people who are COVID positive or under investigation, people under investigation should also be in hotels. If everybody could get into hotels, that would be good. But if they can't, the indication from CDC, it's not an opinion from me, it's an opinion of CDC, is that what I said before, that people who are ill could be in congregate settings like medicalized settings, and people who are not positive could be in congregate settings with social distancing. Having said that, it's very, very difficult to maintain social distancing in shelter, and it would be better if people were in separate units.
Okay, so we do have an audio question here, and then we'll go to Juan Pablo after that. Audio question from Katie Frankowitz of the Daily Historian in Oregon. So Katie, I think you're being unmuted. Okay, so
okay.
Katie, you can go ahead and ask your question.
So I live in a county that is very impacted by this because it's a tourist economy, and all the restaurants and hotels are being affected. You already have people who are living paycheck to paycheck. So I just keep on thinking of our local social services who administer a variety of programs, federal and state, and kind of what they're doing now that everybody potentially is in need, or a large population. Within those programs, that we have veterans programs that could apply to a homeless veteran as well as a veteran who just needs that program but might already have housing somewhere else. So is there any kind of discussion among the agencies and services that offer housing programs to differentiate more between people who need housing but are already housed and then the homeless, or is there more of a need to parse that out given that a wide variety of groups will likely be impacted by the coronavirus and need some kind of housing assistance? Does that make sense?
Well, I think it would certainly make sense to try to support people with rental assistance if they need it. It could be shallow rental assistance. That's proven to be effective in a lot of cases. It's starting to rain here. You may be hearing that in the background. I apologize. Obviously, people who don't have any housing, in my opinion, should be prioritized, but it certainly doesn't make sense to have a lot of people get evicted right after this pandemic is over and the economy is doing so badly. I do think we're likely to see some of that.
Okay. So now we will go to Juan Pablo. Juan Pablo Garnham reports on urban affairs for the Texas Tribune, focusing on the main challenges of the state's largest metro areas, Houston, Austin, San Antonio, El Paso, and Dallas-Fort Worth. He's based in Dallas. He has a slideshow to share with us. So Juan Pablo, if you could pull that up, and he is going to talk about coverage issues and how to find story ideas and execute those story ideas. Juan Pablo will be the last of our 4 speakers, and so if you want to get additional questions in during the Q&A session, raise your hand now, or put your question in right now, and we will have time when Juan Pablo is done to go over those.
Thank you so much for the invitation. I'm gonna try to be quick, so I'm probably gonna have to skip a lot of things, but to any of my colleagues in this event, please feel free to DM me. My handle on Twitter is @JPGarnham, and I'm happy to talk more there. I wanted to start telling you a little story that happened to me last week. We have published this article. I helped Stacy and Naomi on this piece that was about, well, April 1st, the rent was due and what was going on with renters. And it was pretty thorough. We covered all bases. It had a little bit of explaining and also a lot of service-oriented journalism in it. But quickly we started receiving messages from our audience asking us questions. It's something that's constantly happening for us in the Tribune, but in this case, we got a couple of messages from people that were living in motels and that actually have been paying rent every Friday on time, without any problem, without any kind of issue. And sadly, they were unemployed, and now they were having trouble, and they were already having harassment from the management of the hotels. And we realized that we hadn't covered that on the piece. So we did what we journalists do. We started talking to the people that were going through this problem. We talked to housing experts and lawyers. We explained the answers not only for our readers, but we also went back to these people that emailed us and connected them with the solutions that lawyers had connected us previously. I spoke with my editor. We decided to update the same article so that all the information was there. But just in case, I decided to make a little thread, a short thread of 6 or 7 messages, just updating, very simple, very direct, what we know, what we don't know. We know that hotel guests are normally not tenants, but if you are in the situation where you actually live like a tenant, so you pay week by week, you don't have cleaning service, etc., you actually are a tenant for legal purposes in Texas. So the current moratoriums that we have apply to them. And we also mentioned a list of legal aid services across the state that could help them. The audience editors in our team have told me that apparently they've been sharing this thread a lot, because they keep having people asking them about this situation. So I get like 3 lessons out of this story. First, that audience engagement pays. It always pays, but it's paying a lot right now, and we should definitely keep an eye and invest in that. Second, that this is the time for service and solutions journalism. It's really nice to have beautiful narratives and articles that read like a novel, but right now people need solutions, and we should have that in every single piece that we do. And third, that there's a lot of stories that are hiding in our blind spots. So I'm gonna go very quickly through these things. First, audience and engagement. We've been doing callouts constantly and using Screendoor, a software to manage all the information that is coming from people. We've got thousands of entries which not only help us understand what's going on with our audience, but also when we are doing a story, we can search there and find possible cases that help us report on this. We also have newsletters, Facebook groups, and a really active team in this area. And I'm happy to connect anyone with our team at the Tribune if you want to learn how we're doing this. Second, I mean, my experience comes from covering immigrant communities. And when you cover immigrant communities, you realize that all journalism has to be service journalism because you're trying to explain people how to live in a new country, right? I think right now we're all in the same boat. So we need answers. We do it in most of our articles, but we also have a special section, the explainer, which we can use as an evergreen with specific questions, and we keep updating those. And the thing that I wanted to dive in a little bit deeper is this idea of looking into our blind spots. So we already mentioned motels and hotels, and I know that someone in the group in this event was already asking about that. Then we have RV parks, which in Matthew's book are very well covered, and I think we really need to be thinking about what's going on there. I also want to mention our undocumented and migrant communities and the urban, suburban, rural divide, because especially right now, but also as we start seeing evictions when the moratoriums lifts, I think the resources that each one of these groups will have are going to be very, very different. So just 3 stories to mention as examples where I've covered these different gaps. We went to rural Texas to look at how homelessness looks in counties that are less populated and that are more sparse in terms of population. And we realized that something quite obvious, we have a lack of services in areas that are less populated, and also it's much more difficult to identify where the people in need are. And I think this all will apply to the problems in terms of evictions and housing that we're going to see and that we're already seeing, right? Second, this story was about the point in time count, the count that we have across the country. The first half was about it, just following a group of people that were doing this point in time in the center of Dallas. But for me, the second half was more important actually, which was realizing how different this count is in suburban areas where people are much more difficult to find and where we see numbers that might be as large or that can be very large compared even to our biggest cities. And the third item that I wanted to mention is undocumented families and communities. This is actually not a housing story, but it's kind of like a housing story in disguise. This was when in June, it was like announced that there would be massive raids in like 10 or 12 cities across the US. And I went to Houston, and the question that we basically the streets where migrant communities were deserted. So we went into a house. It was really difficult to find a family willing to open the door for us. And we realized how important housing can be in moments where you're in fear, when you need that basic protection of space. And it begs the question of what will happen is those families that only have that space as a safe space right now will have an eviction or might be in risk of being evicted. So I think all the links will be shared somewhere. I'm happy to share them too. If you have any questions, feel free to email me or DM me whenever you want. Thank you.
Okay, so thank you very much. So we have plenty of time for some questions. Let me take one right now from Greg LaRose of WDSU in New Orleans. Most data focused on eviction filings and most data focused on eviction filings and court decisions. Our local housing advocates are tracking informal notices ranging from verbal eviction threats to posted notices on property management letterhead. Do any of you panelists compile comparable data or advise against using it in your reporting? So I guess Matthew or Alieza or Nan, any of you, do you have thoughts on that?
So this is really important. Court-ordered evictions are just one slice of the displacement story. And so informal evictions can range from anything from a landlord paying you money to leave, just telling you to leave, to actually doing something more strong-armed, like changing your locks or hiring people to force you out. We did a study in Milwaukee that I'll send you on the chat that shows that in Milwaukee, about half of all informal evictions are half of all forced moves are informal evictions, which means if we're just counting the formal, we're going to miss the whole picture. In New York City, they replicated the study and they found that formal evictions were actually outpacing informal, which makes sense. If you live in a city that has more tenant protections and even the right to counsel in eviction court, you're more likely to exercise your right through a formal process.
Okay. All right, so one quick question for Nan from Adora Namingadi. Nan, do you have any insight on whether homeless shelter workers and residents have access to masks or PPE?
They don't have very good access to PPE at all. We just put out a survey generally online. We got about 800 responses a few weeks ago, so it might be a bit better now. But the major complaint was that people didn't have any kind of PPE.
Okay, so now we have a audio question from Travis Fain of WRAL News. Travis, you're unmuted and you can ask your question.
Yeah, thank you. I'm in North Carolina. I understand that the wave will probably come after the courts reopen, but what is the thinking on when the kind of triggering event wave will happen? April 5th, I guess rent would have been due, but now we're getting the stimulus payments hopefully starting to roll out this week. And then is May the problem? Is June, do we have any idea about when the real massive problem of people being unable to pay their rent and landlords forcing the issue is likely to come?
So I think from our best estimates, if what we know right now is that a third of renters already had trouble and missed rent payments in April, we suspect that that will only increase over time. The relief bill checks would barely cover sort of the average month's rent. So that might help for 1 month, but it wouldn't, it's not enough to cover rent plus food plus utilities. So, it's possible that wave could start now because we're already seeing so many renters miss payments and increase over time in the absence of broader government intervention and rental assistance. Do you have anything to add, Matt?
Okay, so next question, we have Aaron Rode from the Ventura County Star, a text question. Aaron writes, I've had several sources tell me they received 3-day notices this month in spite of local eviction moratoriums. She's in Southern California. But many of them are afraid of going on the record because they fear retaliation from their landlord. Does anyone have any advice on verifying that this is happening without jeopardizing someone's home? I guess Matt or Alieza?
So the way to think about housing law, I think in general, is it literally costs money. So if you're someone that's paying 70% of your income to rent and you move in and your landlord requests last month's rent security deposit, there's no way you can pay that. And so you're behind on day one, and that puts you in a really legally precarious position. And when you don't have a right to a lawyer in housing court, when housing court is basically kind of an eviction processing plant, when you can get evicted for calling the city and reporting a landlord for housing violations, not because those retaliatory evictions are legal, but because you're just behind anyways. That's kind of the broader context in which tenants are entering into this crisis. So even if there is broad coverage in an area, there are many areas of the country where exercising your rights as a tenant is actually a really risky and even irrational thing to do from a survival point of view. We've been hearing the same thing from our contacts on the ground, but I don't have any systematic data to suggest how often it's happening, but we've been hearing similar things.
Okay. We have a quick follow-up question from Travis to Alieza. The statistic that 1/3 of renters missed payments in April, where does that come from?
Sure. So there, I can circulate this to you, Chris. This was covered in the New York Times last week based on a survey put out by, forgetting the exact name, but an association of landlords. So I can send I don't remember the exact title to you, but that is the data that we're working off of as a rough estimate. So I could follow up via email.
Okay. I got a follow-up from Katie Frankowitz with the Daily Historian. And I also want to just remind folks, if you would like to ask a question, ask your question via audio, raise your hands, and we'll work those questions in. The follow-up from, where did my follow-up from Katie? Follow-up from Katie. There are other big pressures on landlords besides mortgages. Are there other big pressures on landlords besides mortgages we should be considering when we report?
Katie, I just sent you a study that shows that most landlords' regular expenses are the biggest expenses they face. Mortgages are one of the big ones, but also taxes, insurance, and overhead. And I'll put that in the chat.
Okay, I have a question here. Can Matthew or others, I guess, say anything about the impact of evictions on families with kids? Is there a cascade of negative consequences that you see among families with kids?
So kids are a risk factor of eviction anyway. So a study published a few years ago shows that families who go to eviction court, if they live with kids, their chances of getting evicted actually triple, all else equal. Because from a landlord's perspective, kids are liabilities. They're more expensive. They use more water. They cause more property damage. And so children actually don't prevent eviction in most cases. They actually invite it. After eviction, kids often have to switch schools. If families are moving to neighborhoods with higher levels of crime and poverty, that's obviously bad for kids' development. If families are moving into substandard housing, that's linked to children's health issues and mental health issues. We have a study that shows that mothers who experience eviction express depression 2 years later. Seems to stay with you. That has to have an effect on your ability to parent too. So yes, I think that this is something that's leaving a deep and jagged scar on the next generation anyways. And it's only going to increase if there isn't some significant intervention in this crisis.
Okay. So I have a question mostly for Nan. What is in the stimulus bill about mortgages? Is there foreclosure protection in one of the final bills, and is it meaningful?
I believe that there is mortgage forbearance for homes in which the financing involves public funds. To be honest with you, almost nobody who owns a home and has to leave it because of mortgage issues becomes homeless. So I'm not that familiar with that as a policy matter, but I do believe it's only for properties that are for homes where the federal government resources are involved in financing the loans.
Okay. So I have a general question for kind of all of you. I mean, it's in part for Juan, Pablo as the journalist of the room, Alieza is a journalist also, and Matthew's a writer and researcher. And but this is the third of 3 sessions, webinars that we've done on homelessness issues, and we're hearing from some journalists out there that their editors feel that the story has been done on homelessness, and there's a feeling of a little bit of exhaustion on it. I mean, how do reporters kind of fight the exhaustion to, I guess, convince their editors and the readers out there of the significance of these kind of stories? Any general thoughts from any of you on that?
Well, you should first.
Yeah, Juan.
Go ahead, Juan.
I think, well, first, that's one of the reasons why I was mentioning these gaps. I think in those gaps, there's like a lot of space to renew and refresh this story. I also really appreciated what Matthew's book has done for us into looking at housing issues, in the sense that when we see this division between if you read the book, you'll see that there's this after, during, and before kind of like way of thinking. And already just that focusing on one of those spaces might also help a lot to renew things and refresh ideas, story ideas. So I think digging deeper, also doing good explainers. I mean, there's so much to explain about the data and the numbers of homelessness, the way that we look at it. There's a lot of pending questions. It's just a matter of like digging a little bit deeper. For example, going back to an issue that I'm passionate about, how Latinos are experiencing this issue of homelessness. A lot of times, Latinos are actually disproportionately less homeless in the numbers of the point-in-time counts. And that's like an open question. Why? There are some theories, we could talk a lot about that, but that, for example, is another good idea of like refreshing that. And I mean, what I've seen at least is that behind that, there's another issue of overcrowding and families living doubled up, right? And that's another way of looking into homelessness and housing issues that might be able to refresh the stories.
Okay.
Yeah,
Alieza, yeah.
Yeah, if I can just second that, I think that there are a number of issues that just haven't been reported on and different ways of approaching the story. I mean, it's, you know, an issue affecting Latinos. It's like an issue I've been talking about with folks in sort of the domestic violence and gender-based violence space as one of the causes of homelessness for women and children around the country, and many of whom may be housed with an abuser right now. In talking with a lot of folks in the legal aid community, I've also discovered that even though the court process has, you know, slowed to a stop in some ways, the consumer debt collection process is still ongoing. So there are concerns that debt collectors might go after the relief bill checks if and when they arrive. So, you know, this is a debt story. This is a story that, you know, is going to affect every demographic in the country. And, you know, it's not a personal or moral failing to be sick or to be affected by this. You know, it really highlights the interdependence of our communities and ability to, I think, really, you know, come together and point towards those solutions that Juan Pablo was like discussing. So I think get creative with your pitches, but I'm also happy to talk with you one-on-one if you're having trouble. Yeah.
Okay, and final thoughts of the program to you, Nan. Any other ways you can kind of boost the relevance of these stories?
Well, I think that homelessness really is a housing affordability story, as Matthew laid out right at the beginning. And housing affordability, which has been around, or the lack of affordable housing, that issue has been around for a long time, but it just now seems to be being paid more attention to. The ramifications of having so many people who can't afford their housing, the poor health outcomes, the poor education outcomes, criminal justice outcomes. And so I think homelessness it's more, I think, important to look at homelessness as a housing story. And there's a lot more that needs to be said about housing, I think.
Okay. And with that, I want to thank all of our participants and all of the folks on the Zoom call with us today. I want to thank Matthew, Desmond, and we've been talking about his book, Evicted. It's not as nice as having a nice hardback, but this is my Nook version of Evicted. It's a fabulous piece of policy research and a fabulous piece of nonfictional literature. I would encourage all of you, if you haven't read it, to do so. It's great journalism and nonfiction writing all at once. I want to thank Kaiser Permanente, which provided the National Press Foundation support for these 3 sessions we've had on homelessness and COVID-19 issues. And I want to give you a reminder for next Monday, noon Eastern Time, we will have a book talk with author John Barry from New Orleans, talking about his Great Influenza, his masterpiece, History on the Influenza Pandemic of 1918. And with that, I want to thank all of you, thank our speakers and our viewers, and tell everybody to be safe out there. Thank you and have a good day.